All right, so again, my name is Jason Ertz. I'm a librarian over at the College of DuPage Library. And today what we're going to talk about is kind of the idea of fake news. Put that in quotes right now, and the issue surrounding it. So let me share my screen with you. Again, I will be talking for the first half hour or so, kind of giving a presentation on some things we need to consider. And then the second half of the hour will be Q&A. Any questions you might have, any problems you've kind of noticed or been dealing with when it comes to information sources, we can discuss that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen to you guys. Bear with me here. Get started. All right. So first, let's not call it fake news, right? Fake news, and we'll get into this particular problem here in a couple of minutes, but that's how I'm titling this currently. Check your emotions, check the source, and then, and only then, evaluate the information at hand. And that's an important kind of, I don't want to call them steps, but those are important things to remember. Emotional check the source, is it worthy of your time, and then to evaluate the information from that source. So some important things. So the black hole that is the internet, right? There's lots of things going on out on the internet. It seems infinite, right? The internet has strengths and the internet has weaknesses, and those sometimes, in many cases, are the same thing. Right? One of the great strengths of the internet is that it allows us to share information rapidly. It allows us to both find and create information of our own, as well as, you know, this issue of this quickly and freely communicate that information across our social networks. That's both its strength and both its weakness, right? Because not all information is of the same quality, and it is important and it's difficult in some cases for us to make that determination as citizens, as community members, or whatever it might be. So that's an important thing. Our objectives today are quite simple. Really, we're going to start looking at we're going to give some definitions about what fake news is, the phrase, and disinformation, and the other factors that are influencing how we search for information and how we select information, right, from our searches. These are important things to remember. We'll talk about that initially. Second aspect is what can we do ourselves to help prevent the spread of disinformation and really confuse our perspective on what might be real, what might be actually going on in the world. This is a real problem. And hopefully today we'll give you some tools, some tips, and some skills for evaluating information around this. And then, of course, we'll start our questions. So one of the issues, the big issue here is that the screen is it, right? Particularly during the pandemic, the screen has been our beast, and that's kind of how we get a lot of our information. Hopefully we're still reading physical books and physical articles and these kinds of things, but it is important that we remember that a lot of our information is coming from the screen, and from this space, if you can call it a space, whether it's monitor, laptop, tablet, mobile phone, whatever it might be, we need to pay particular attention to how we distinguish between types of information. It is important that people understand how information is created, right? This is very important to remember how certain pieces of information are created versus how other pieces of information are created without any physical cues, right? It all looks the same. It's all coming from the browser. So that's an important thing to kind of deal with as we get started here. Right, some other factors affecting how we search for information and how we select it. These are the big three that we're kind of, right? Disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. We're going to get into this in some detail. Internet algorithms. Internet algorithms in search engines and social media and other places are particularly problematic when it comes to finding information, right? And what information is shown to us. That's a very important thing. Information is shown to us, not entirely based on what we asked for, but based on a whole host of other things that are cooked into the algorithms. So that's an interesting problem that we have to deal with. And third is that whether we like it or not, or whether we even know it cognitively, we process information initially emotionally, right? That's what we tend to do when we read a piece of information or watch a piece of information. We tend to initially process it emotionally. So how do we deal with that? So one of the problems with the phrase fake news, and this is why we don't use fake news in academic circles, and we tend to focus more on the disinformation. One of the main reasons is that the phrase fake news has been kind of almost overused in particular contexts where basically a lot of us use it to delegitimize something we disagree with. Whether it's false or not, we're just going to call it fake news, right? Fake news, right? If a friend says to me, oh, Brussels sprouts are the best vegetable on earth, I'm like, oh, no, fake news. It's a joke now to some degree. And so the phrase has lost a lot of meaning in terms of labeling things as such. For that reason, a number of academics have started to develop definitions about the various kinds of fake news that we're kind of dealing with here. So there's the label problem, but there's also the problem that it's actually being created. People are actually creating false information. And so how do we deal with that, right? And also real news is being warped, and that's another problem that we have to deal with as well. And the rapid sharing over networks, where you can lose control of a piece of information or you have no control over it very fast. So that's kind of why we don't say fake news. But we do say misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. These are the three broad spectrum type of ideas, right? Disinformation is the big one. You see it right here in the middle, right? In this Venn diagram, we see falseness as one, and we see intent to harm as the other circle. And in the middle is disinformation, right? Disinformation is intentionally false or misleading. It's 100% fabricated in many cases and set to cause harm. And that harm does not have to be physical harm. It could be mental harm or confusion or these kinds of things are included in that. And why they're created tend to be a number of reasons. Money is one, like clickbait. If I click on this, they get paid. Political influence, or just anarchists, right? They just want to cause problems. Those are some of the reasons we see disinformation start to materialize. Now, misinformation is different than that, in that when we share disinformation, it becomes misinformation. We may, particularly us individually, may have a interest in helping our social networks, our families, our friends, our colleagues. Right? We found this piece of information. I want to share it to you guys to help you. That is our intent in many cases. We have no intent to harm, but the problem is what we ended up sharing turned out to be false. And so now it's still out in the network. And this body got shared a number of other times too. And so the misinformation, the sharing of information, disinformation is actually a misinformation. That's a problem because once it's in the networks, it can really move fast throughout Twitters or Facebooks or Instagram. Right? But again, your intention is not to hurt anybody, but to actually to inform people. And then later on, you find out it wasn't true. That's misinformation. Now, malinformation is a little bit more difficult to get our hands around, in that with malinformation, it's a form of disinformation in that and we see this a lot more now, in that we take pieces of information that are actual or true or real, genuine content, and we put them together where they don't belong, right? And a very common example of this is when you see an image attached to an article, trying to evoke some kind of emotion based on the image and the article, when in fact the image is not about anything to do with the article, and in fact is probably years old or from some other type of issue. Right? We might see these huge problems of riots, right? All these images of riots, and here we see the Portland riots are out of control, when in fact, if you figure out where the image came from, the image wasn't even taken in Portland, and it was taken 3 years ago in LA, right? And we see this happen a lot of time, and this is what malinformation is. Another example of that is kind of identity theft. but we weaponize the context of the information that we're using, as Dr. Wardall indicated from the first right? We reframe it. And this is really difficult in some cases to happen upon. So that's them, right? Misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So there are 7 basic forms of this information disorder that we're kind of discussing here. And these are them. From the left, we have less intent to harm. And to the right, we have more intent to harm. And when it comes to the arrow, you can see the arrow in the middle there. Satire is false information. It's what it is, right? But most people don't fall for it. It's funny in many cases, but fundamentally it is false, right? So that's why it sits here on the far left. You know, misleading content, imposter content, and fabricated content. These are all forms of disinformation. It's worse as we move down the line. On the bottom line here, we see malinformation, making false connections when a headline doesn't match the content or the image doesn't, right? Or the context is changed for the information. And so these are the kinds of things we need to pay attention to when we're looking at information, right? At the bottom, you can see the link there. This is a great document to kind of give you more information, a more detailed definition of these 7 forms. I highly recommend it. It's not terribly hard to read. And I'll give you guys the slides later on. So that's disinformation is that particular issue that we're dealing with here. Broadly speaking, I'm going to use that as the broad term for all 3 of them. But disinformation is not biased information. And in many cases, people provide judgments and give information tends to have a bias, whether we like it or not. Even I might have. I probably do. But that doesn't mean that biased information is necessarily false or disinformation, right? Some people have a political bias, some people have a social bias, some people have gender bias or economic biases. These are very real. Sometimes they're not that dramatic or extreme, but they do help people understand the world and help them describe what they're seeing in the world. It's not necessarily false, but it is a particular perspective that we have to pay attention to. And we can't automatically just say, oh, I disagree with you, false news, fake news, right? And that's what we kind of want to get away from here. It's just dismissing everybody. If it doesn't agree with me, it must be false, right? That is not a position to take when it comes to being an informed citizen. So that's a particular thing to remember. And my point here at the bottom is do you know how an information source is produced and shared? This is a very important thing to remember when it comes to any information source. I don't really care where it comes from, right? Do people know the characteristics of op-eds for standard news reporting in the same newspaper? That in and of itself can confuse people because, again, we're in the one screen. And not all the time are op-eds labeled precisely, or we might Google it and we just happen upon that article, right? We don't actually look through the newspaper. So these are things we have to pay attention to as we're kind of looking at information. And we can't automatically assume if it's biased, it's false, right? That's not always the case. So the second thing we have to deal with when it comes to this problem of finding quality information is the internet algorithms. This has become a relatively new topic for myself because I've been noticing these problems on and on for a number of years. And personally, I've been kind of watching the kinds of things that I see in my searches. And then I started to see a lot of different studies coming about looking at this particular problem. One thing about internet algorithms is that we need to understand how information flows through these systems and these infrastructures. It's very important. And we have to understand that there's a fundamental belief system that shapes our information environment, right? Whether that's, and that these systems tend to be social and were created by humans. And with that creation by humans, these infrastructures whether that's a social media or a Google box or whatever it might be, tend to have their own biases kind of cooked into them to some degree. So we have to be careful of that as we go forward, and we have to start to understand and become aware of what algorithms are doing to what we see presented to us on the internet, what we see presented to us in our news feeds, right? Remember, we may ask for something, but it's not necessarily going to give us everything that we ask for. It's going to give us what it thinks we want based on these algorithms. Some aspects of internet algorithms that can be problematic. One, just knowing that the algorithms exist and what's going on there. And an easy example of this is, you might be searching for some boots online, right? You didn't buy them, so. But then you start doing other searches and you start noticing all the ads are with those boots in them, right? The boots will not go away. Every web page you go on, the boots come up in the ads on any web page. That's what's going on here in many cases. Seeing the algorithm kind of push content that you might be interested in. And advertising is one of the biggest users of that. Second is this using social media as a search tool. We just need to stop doing that, right? You're adding layers of systems on top of other layers of systems, and it becomes difficult to see where in fact this information comes from. How do we get to the source of the information, right? We have to crawl through Facebook, and then maybe it's a Twitter, somebody posted a tweet on a Facebook page. So not only is it a picture of a tweet from one system, then we have to look at it inside the Facebook system. And then we have to see if we can't find it on the open internet using a search engine of some kind. And then there's all the issues surrounding how it was produced in and of itself. So social media as a search tool can be problematic in that the algorithms are pretty strong in terms of how, deciding what might be interesting to you. Right? A second thing, and I won't get into this too much just for time's sake, is data voids. And this is a relatively new idea that it's not new, but new to me anyway, and search language. The terms you put in the search box matter a great deal. Even a variation in syntax can modify your results to some degree. In the case of data voids, one of the examples you can see here that I've provided is Sandy Hook actors as a search phrase, right? If you all remember the Sandy Hook massacre a decade ago or so, horrible experience. In all these news avenues, Wall Street Journal, Post, Tribune, New York Times, they're all there reporting on it. All the TV news is there reporting on it. Right? And then somebody says to me, you know what? I heard there were actors. Those were all actors, and the Sandy Hook massacre never really happened. And I'm like, oh, that sounds crazy. But one night I'm sitting there on the, Googling things and doing whatever, and I decide to Google Sandy Hook actors. Now, if there isn't any legitimate information about Sandy Hook actors, nothing's going to come up, right? We're not going to find a New York Times article on it. We're probably not going to find a Wall Street Journal article on it either, because it wasn't really a thing. Clearly, these newspapers and these journalistic centers understood by being on the ground that this was in fact a real thing, but somebody said it to me. So if I Googled it though, and those sources came up, legitimate sources, make no mistake, somebody is going to fill that void. And who might be filling that void? That's probably the creators of disinformation, right? And so this becomes an issue. So I typed in Sandy Hook actors, and Google wasn't able to find me anything legitimate, but it did find these things, and here you go. And now I'm starting to think, oh my God. And this is what happens. And now my emotions are running, which is another thing we have to do. But that's a thing to consider, right? The terms I put in the box will dictate what comes back to me. And it's important that we start to understand that. What we type in the search box matters a great deal. Filter bubbles, another aspect of the internet algorithm. This has been around, the idea has been around for 10 years or so by now. Filter bubbles, basically, Google has been personalizing your search results since 2009, whether you knew it or not. And so you'll start to notice that, wow, these things are surprisingly adept at knowing what it is I want to find. Right? But you'll start to notice too that if you are on your own computer and you do a search for gun control, and a friend of yours is on their own computer and they do a search for gun control as well, your results will not be the same, right? They will be curated, personalized to your to your past searches, to your past clicks, to the past websites you might have utilized. This is an important thing to remember as we go forward. Now, there are some arguments that filter bubbles aren't as strong as some might claim that they are, which is something to consider as well. But the problem with these is they kind of start to develop, they help us, well, they kind of almost help us with this confirmation bias, right? We start to find things that we want to be true. Does this align with my personal beliefs? Not, should I adjust my beliefs if this is the information I'm finding, right? It's a very, very different, that can be a difficult thing to kind of assess as we're kind of. So remember that advertising is built around this, and Google's an advertising company in and of itself. I mean, at its foundation, that is what Google, that's how Google makes money. So we have to be careful. Now, maybe not related so much to internet algorithms, but this problem of paying for information will skew your information diet, right? If I'm not going to pay for information, and we've all started to notice paywalls, even in magazines, newspapers, you get 5 or 4 free, and then you got to start paying. In scholarly articles, that's always behind paywalls. That starts to skew what, in fact, we use to inform ourselves, right? You'll notice the article at the bottom here that I've listed is quite good. The truth is paywall, but the lies are free. I love that line, right? And that's a particular thing we have to deal with as we're looking for information, right? Paying for information is a good thing, but can we afford it? And then we get into those kinds of divides, economic divides, who can afford real information. And the third thing to deal with is, of course, our emotions and how technologies kind of manipulate our emotions and kind of grab at our attention. Right? Headlines are meant to skew emotion. They're meant to grab our attention. Advertising, right? That's what advertisers do. Right? They work off your emotional desires and they capture your attention. Engagement bait, right? This is other things that we might see. The cell phone, the allure of the cell phone and the notification problems. This can become very distracting and becomes difficult to think straight in many cases. There has been some studies where the very presence of your cell phone can drop your cognitive ability. 1 or 2 studies have been done on that. I'd like to see more, but those things are starting to crop up in the scholarly research as we're discussing this problem. How our emotional responses handle this matters, right? How do our emotions affect our search behavior? Are we looking for things that agree with us? Or are we looking for the truth? This is an issue that we have to deal with in many cases. And so that's one of the things that our emotions kind of can skew us in that particular direction. Confirmation biases, information overload has an emotional tenet to it, right? This is enough. I don't want to look anymore, right? Information avoidance, right? I don't want to hear about that, right? That's an emotional response to it. And of course, in our social media posting, it is rampant. And things are easy to share, but they really are harder to read. You ever heard TLDR? Too long, didn't read. You might see that on the internet. That's what's going on. Too long, didn't read, but I thought I'd send it to you anyway. That's a problem. We don't always do. Headlines aren't always that good. Headlines, particularly in social media, are meant for you to like, oh yes, I got to share this. When the content has very little to do with what the headline might have said. That's that malinformation. Right? The FOMO, the sense of urgency, fear of missing out, right? So people are constantly on their phone. Ooh, I want to share this. Ooh, this person died. I want to be the first to get it out there. it's almost like a game to some degree, but the sense of urgency, and particularly in the young people, can elicit these emotional responses and really addictions to some degree. If anybody of you are familiar with Stephen Colbert, he coined the term truthiness. And in fact, the American Dialect Society actually created an actual definition and is now in the dictionary and dictionaries all over the world. The quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes to be true rather than concepts or facts known to be true, right? That's truthiness. It's kind of a funny thing, but that's really what's going on, right? Our emotions, what we want to be true. So what do we do? Right? What can we do about this particular problem? Disinformation, the algorithms are kind of sending us things. Our emotions are getting the best of us. What can we do with this? How can we solve this problem? One, get past your initial emotional reaction. Dr. Nicole Cook at the UIUC Information School indicates that there is an effective and affective dimension to information consumption, even if we know better cognitively. It just happens, right? And we have to get past that initial reaction. Michael Caulfield, the author of Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers, also says part of his skill building is check your emotions is the first thing to do. Check them, right? If this thing makes you happy, or super pissed off, you should probably make sure that it is active, right? And that it has some use or is quality. So check our emotions. And Dr. Wardall, again from First Draft, also indicates that we have an emotional relationship with information. And that's an important thing to remember. Algorithms, and we're back to the algorithms, right? Algorithms are designed to reward our emotional responses. And the business model is attached to our attention. We're always focused on the emotion. It's very important to know that. And then lastly is this kind of trust issue. There is a trust issue going on in terms of our media outlets, our scholars, our scientists. There is a trust issue problem kind of materializing, or it already has kind of materialized that we have to deal with. But you need to ask yourself personally, why you trust one source or another. Do you trust the epistemological practices of scientists and scholars, right? How they do their work? Is that an appropriate way to do that kind of work? If it isn't, why do you think it isn't, right? Are the journalistic practices inappropriate, or are they sound? How is something funded? Who pays for these kinds of things? They're important things to remember. And also always in this kind of truth thing, always remember, and this is where some people we lose people, in that they start to fuse skepticism and cynicism, right? These are not the same things. Skepticism is, I'm wondering, I'm doubtful. It's true. I mean, that's fine that you say that it's true, but I'm kind of doubtful and I need to check on it, right? I'm going to still assume it's true until I hear otherwise. A cynic, on the other hand, is someone who thinks that everybody's kind of lying to them now, right? And a lot of these disinformation campaigns aren't always that interested in whether you believe what they're saying, but what they do want is make sure that you believe nobody. And so we want to try to avoid falling into that hole of cynicism, where everybody's lying to me, everybody's wrong, everybody's, and that's a hard thing to kind of deal with as we can. Second, so after we've checked our emotions, breathe it out a little bit. Okay, that article made me feel good, but I need to make sure it's accurate. The second thing to do is read laterally. And I cannot stress the importance of this particular step or this skill. I mean, it's basically a skill that you need to start to do. Reading laterally means if this is the website that I'm looking at, my fist right here, we need to leave it. Horizontally leave the website and open up new browsers and find out about this source of information, right? So if I'm looking at a particular website, I need to make sure that this publisher or this author, who these people are. And to do that, I need to leave the source of information. Don't even spend that much time on it, right? Say you found an article. Okay, great, I found this article. Now leave the site, open up a new tab or a new web page, and start to investigate both the publisher, the author, and is there anything out on the internet that might cause us to pause in terms of whether or not this is a good piece of information or not, right? This skill, and if you read the video is quite good, it's 3 minutes long. You guys take a look at that. The two articles under that are more in-depth discussions of this particular skill set. And that professional fact checkers, this is the thing that they do all the time. Stanford History Group did a study, and one of these articles is from them, that they put students down, they put professional fact checkers, students, and history professors, or I don't know if they were all history professors, and they asked them to compare two websites. All the fact checkers got it right in a matter of minutes. The students took forever, didn't get it all right, and neither did the professors, right? And they were trying to find out what, in fact, did the fact checkers do that was different than what the students and the professors were doing. And this is it, lateral read. Leave the site, find out the information someplace else, okay? Find out more about that publisher, that writer, that author, that scholar, right? We're that talking head. We need to find out more information about that and the publishers and all these things. Very, very important to do this. So after lateral reading, there's reverse image searching, or reverse searching in general. One of those is image searching. So a lot of these TinEye, Google reverse image search, and RevEye, these are great tools that we can use to kind of determine where an image originated from. It's very hard to scrub that information out of an image that's been taken. And so you can very rapidly see if the image that you're seeing in a particular piece of information came from someplace else, right? It's not hard to do. All you have to do is remember to do it. That's the thing. Those tools might be helpful for manipulating problems. Chase citations, right? If an information source has citation, you should follow them, even if it's a news article. So for example, if I'm looking at this article, and I love this article, why? Because it makes me feel good. But I shouldn't, but I should first read the content of this particular article and see if that's helpful. But as I'm looking at something like this, the links in a news article like this become particularly useful citations for me to kind of click through, right? If I can find out what this is, right, click on it and see what the information is telling us. Because a lot of good journalists will use that to use as citations, right? They can't use a end of the paper, works cited, or references page, so they link within the articles, both in news magazines like this, and of course in newspapers as well. A good newspaper article, a good magazine article will have those things, but we need to follow and chase those citations, right? Where is it heading? And then this is kind of an aspect of, another aspect of kind of lateral reading, right? We want to follow the citations and see where they lead. So I'm not going to always take a journalist's word for it, but I want to kind of find out where that information comes from, right? So that reverse searching going back to the citation, particularly helpful. And then, of course, there's our evaluation criteria. Evaluation criteria can be incredibly helpful after we've laterally read to determine reputation and quality of the publisher or author or funder or whatever it might be, website, creator, these kinds of things. If we can't determine quality there, a lot of times I'm just going to skip reading it altogether, right? If I find out that this publisher or this organization is a pseudo hate group, I'm done reading, right? I'm not going to be reading anymore of it. I don't need to evaluate it at all. So remember, evaluation criteria happens after we laterally read and after we determine, whether images are sound, these kind of things. Remember that. And these are the basic, is it relevant? Is it complex? Do you have your quality criteria that it meets? These are important things to remember. And remember, we're always learning. Scholarship is a conversation that is always building on itself. And sometimes we find something out, and then 10 years later, we find out it's not true. That is part of the scientific process. That's part of the scholarly process. This is what we knew based on all the given evidence at the time, but now we know this, right? We didn't know this before. And that happens. That happens in scholarship all the time. And a question I always ask people to ask themselves is, do you want to base your professional or personal reputation on this source? If you're not sure, you probably don't want to share it. Right? And then, of course, there's other evaluation criteria you may determine that it's important. These are the ones that College of DuPage determines, things that we should probably pay attention to. Who do we think it's written for? Its audience, right? That's important. The authority, who wrote it and why do I care what they have to say? Though we do a lot of this when we laterally read, we still have to consider the scholar and these kinds of things, or the academic or the expert that we're kind of seeing on the news. Right? If I see an expert on the news, I usually Google them immediately. If I'm watching television news and they present me an expert, I Google them. If I'm watching a documentary and there's an expert there, Google them, right? I'm gonna need to find out who these people are and why I should care. It's important, yeah. Accuracy, is it accurate, right? Chasing citations, image searching, triangulation, which is a more complex idea about, verifying. If 5 sources say the same thing, then that could be an element or a kind of a simplistic version of triangulation. Right? I have 5 different places saying that this happened there, right? Sandy Hook Massacre happened based on the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, Fox News, Chicago Tribune. All of these places say that, right? We can kind of triangulate that issue. Coverage, does it provide extra sources? Does it provide other things to read that we might be interested in? And currency, how old is it? That can matter depending on the topic. And objectivity, right? Is it as objective as possible? Now, the possibility of objectivity is a difficult beast, right? All of us have some kind of bias, but it's important that we can try to be as objective as possible as this information as such. That can be very important. So remember, check before you share. As professionals, as students, as citizens, as family members, it's very important that we check before we share information. Remember, disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Check your emotions before you share something out. Right, that's a very important thing. And start to learn about internet algorithms. How are the algorithms providing me information, both in my Facebook feed and in my Google searches? Right, what is going on there that I need to know about as we're kind of going forward? And if you're unsure, always ask a librarian. Now, it doesn't have to just be a librarian, but I imagine the Carroll Stream Public Library has some great librarians that can help you. The College of DuPage Library has some librarians that we can help you determine quality, help you determine if the source is reputable. Right? We do it all the time as part of our job. And so always ask a librarian or another knowledgeable person that you might know that can kind of help. Okay, and that's it. I provide some additional information there, but that will do it for my presentation.